I hate to start off this podcast on a very controversial note, but did you know, Tim, that not all drums are created equally?
Hang on.
I know. So if you've ever been around in a band or recorded anything or played a live show,
like you,
like I have, I didn't want to throw myself under the bus or toot my own horn. But you'll notice if you've ever even been around for like a sound check, even not every so eventually what you hear at a concert is a full drum kit, but a full drum kit is a grouping of different drums, right? Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, the drum kit that we have today wasn't the drums that they were using in the Revolutionary War,
right?
And so, even that drum isn't the same drums that we have, and so, but there's actually an order to how the drums are mixed, right? And so, if you go to a sound check, you'll find that like the single most important drum, and a lot of people might disagree with this, but this is the truth. The first thing always sound checked is the kick. The kick drum is the first thing because it literally is the beat. It's the boom, boom, boom. Okay, so and then it goes to snare. Then usually it goes to your toms, and usually it's high tom, mid tom if you have a mid tom, and then your low, your floor tom, and then it goes to cymbals, which are part of the drums, but they're not technically drums in themselves.
They're percussion.
And so there's this very interesting order to drums that kind of in a way says that some take precedent over others.
That makes a lot of sense when you explain it that way.
Right.
Now, would you say that there's a specific drum that you love the most?
Well, in that particular recording, I love the low tom. The low tom mix that we got out of that bad boy was just real. That floor was really booming that day. I'm a big kick guy. I think the kick drum really it sets it, And when the bass player and the kick drum are locked in step, it's kind of like a meeting the Lord moment, It's just
There's I can't think of the name of the band off the top of my head. It's the two brothers, kind of folksy band, and they had a song that "My Heart Is a Kick Drum," and they would play. Is it
the Avid Brothers?
Yeah, Avid Brothers.
Yeah. And see, there you go, right there. They got a kick drum and they got a hi-hat. And actually, funny story. My friend, his name was Jacob, was the drummer of that band.
No way.
Yeah.
So there you go, name drop. Brandon's famous. So you would probably put it in order here on this podcast. Brandon first, Tim second.
But the true order is actually reversed. It's really Tim and Brandon's just here,
That's right. Yeah. I wrote the notes. Oh gosh. So, we're going to talk about something today that is about ordering, right? It's about having an order, and we're going to talk about, is this concept biblical or not? And the technical term for it, I think is it Latin?
Yeah, Latin.
Ordo Amoris, or the order of love.
Right.
Now, the concept of Ordo Amoris comes from Augustine and his work, The City of God. And the translation is order of love or order of charity,
right? Which
I kind of like a little bit more. You can also say an order of affections. It's been referred to as the ladder of love.
Yes.
But what's interesting about this concept, and we're gonna break it down a little bit here, Ordo Amoris does not suggest that one item or thing or person or ideal is better than another.
Right.
Simply that one might be higher in priority when it comes to our efforts of affection or charity.
Right.
That makes sense.
Right.
So let me read. This is Augustine from The City of God. And he said, "And thus beauty, which is indeed God's handiwork, but only a temporal, carnal, and lower kind of good, is not fitly loved in preference to God, the eternal, spiritual, and unchangeable good. For though it be good, it may be loved with an evil as well as a good love. It is loved rightly when it is loved ordinately, evilly when inordinately. But if the Creator is truly loved, that is, if he himself is loved and not another thing in his stead, he cannot be evilly loved. For love itself is to be ordinately loved, because we do well to love that which, when we love it, makes us live well and virtuously. So that it seems to me that it is a brief but true definition of virtue to say it is the order of love." So what Augustine is saying here is when something is loved out of order, it's loved evilly.
Right.
When you misprioritize love, so we always talk about love is the great thing, right?
Right.
It's the great commandment, it's to love,
Right.
but when you misprioritize your love, what he was arguing is that you are committing evil.
Right.
Right. And you're like, well, how can love be evil? Well, we'll get to that.
Right.
But, something that the scripture says, 1 Timothy 4:4, everything created by God is good and to be received with thanksgiving. Right. So again, we see not everything is worthy of love.
Right.
Right. Every person is worthy of love.
Right.
Every good thing comes from God.
Right.
Right. But not everything can be enacted upon or prioritized at the highest priority.
Right.
Right.
Well, and I think it's important for us to understand, too, why Augustine, however you want to say it, is writing. So the city of God is really interesting because this is like basically the first time Christians they're struggling with the idea of what does our life look like in public, right? Because this is the first time in a long time that they've been able to be public.
Yeah.
For a lot of this time leading up to Augustine, it's been in I won't say tombs. I mean, some of them were tombs, but house churches. It was small. It was reserved. Yeah. But thanks to Constantine starting all of Christianity, that was a tongue-in-cheek reference to an earlier episode. But thanks to this idea that Christians can now be in the public, there's this idea of what does that look like? How do we relate to the world around us? Now that we can openly relate to the world around us, what does that look like? What does charity look like when it's not done internally, right? Within the home, what does charity look like in the world? And so I think it's really important to understand what Augustine is doing here is he, as you said, he's not saying that love less down these levels, but he's saying that there are levels in which we are called to love first.
Right.
And so that's what he's saying. That is orderly love. And
right.
that's what he's talking to his audience about is what does love look like in the world? Well, it starts with blank, and that's what we're going to talk about.
Right, exactly. So another quote from him, the good make use of the world in order to enjoy God, but the evil in contrast want to make use of God in order to enjoy the world.
Right.
So again, this is like a priority issue, right? This is what comes first, right? The practical example I think of when I hear this statement is in 1 John, when he talks about if you say you love your brother who you've seen,
right,
or if you say you love God but you can't love your brother who you've seen,
right,
then you're a liar.
You don't really truly love God, right?
And I think people will sometimes read something like that, take it and contextualize it in a way that says, well, if you don't do these things that are loving to your brother, then you don't love God.
Right.
They define what that looks like.
Right.
Identify this is what you should be doing, and if you don't do this, then you can't love God.
Right.
When what we should be doing is saying, what does it look like to love God?
Right.
Because that will inform how I love
others.
Correct. Right. And I think it's the backwards prioritization.
Right.
Let's do a C.S. Lewis quote.
Right.
Because why not?
Why not?
So this is 3 different quotes from him. And this is from The Four Loves. So he said, we use a most unfortunate idiom when we say a lustful man prowling the streets that he wants a woman. Strictly speaking, a woman is just what he does not want. He wants a pleasure for which a woman happens to be the necessary piece of apparatus. How much he cares about the woman as such may be gauged by his attitude to her 5 minutes after fruition. One does not keep the carton after one has smoked the cigarettes. Now, Eros makes a man really want, not a woman, but one particular woman. In some mysterious but quite indisputable fashion, the lover desires the beloved herself, not the pleasure she can give, right? So again, we're seeing he's using the illustration of being a womanizer,
right?
Of do you love women or do you love what they do for you,
right?
And there's in order to enjoy the second one, right? So I think when we think about this, sex is a good thing, right? God created it, but when it's out of order, it's an evil thing.
It's an evil thing, right? Exactly,
It's a hurtful and harmful thing.
That's right, yeah.
Right? And so this is the analogy that C.S. Lewis is giving us here. So when love is out of order, it despises what is actually good and substitutes it with gratification.
Sure.
right? And so you could argue some find gratification in grandstanding and virtue signaling about who we ought to love and how.
Right.
I think this is something we see in the culture wars right now.
Right.
And I think it's, there's not a specific group of people or a specific ideological group of people that do this. Everybody does this.
Right.
Where it's not about loving others. It's about telling others to love others.
Right.
And so this is what Augustine is saying when he says you make use of God.
Mm-hmm.
It is wanting to appear as if God is on your side instead of committing to be on his.
Right.
Right. Does this make sense?
Right. It's the difference between saying, if you love God, you do this, and saying, do this and you love God.
Right.
You see, and there's the difference, and the nuance there is one is God is the subject of the love, and the other one is God is the object of the love.
Right.
And this is what Augustine's really trying to get at is God is always the subject.
Right.
He's always the center of our love.
Right. Exactly. So let's take a look at a couple practical examples, and we're still kind of working through this. We're setting some foundation, right? So when we talk about like an order of love, we could talk about money, right? So money buys our food, clothing, gets gifts for our family.
Right.
It's what we live on. It is important to our lives, right? But the love of money is the root of all evil.
Right.
So if money is the tool that you use to show love for others, I mean, that's one thing.
Right.
But if others is the excuse you use to justify your love for money,
Right.
then you're misordered.
100%.
Right.
Right.
It's of more importance to obey the law and as opposed to just steal the money that you don't have. Right. So when we look at this, we say, okay, we need money. We need money to live. We need it to do the good things we want to do.
Right.
So why not just take it?
Right.
Well, because in an orderly sense, it's better to earn the money than to steal the money.
Right. Well, not only that, it's their sin. Stealing is a sin.
Stealing is a sin, right?
But
you have to believe in that.
Well, true.
You kind of have to prioritize it, right?
Yeah.
But then here's the thing, right? So when we talk about stealing being a sin, is it always a sin?
Right.
When David takes the
showbread. Yeah.
And I don't know that that's stealing, but
he does ask for it.
Yeah.
He gets confronted and says, "No, God said I need to take this." Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So there's a conversation to be had there, but the question is why.
Right.
So like breaking the law, like we would say we wouldn't want to break the law to get the things that we want.
Right.
But we may say we need to break the law if that law denies, say, human rights.
Sure.
Right. So
that's what David is doing, is feeding his army.
Right. Exactly.
And that's why he says we need this to feed the people.
Right.
And you're just going to throw it away.
Right.
But that's a different argument.
It's a different argument.
It's a whole different argument than what the order of love is even suggesting.
I think though that's why a lot of modern discourse is full of hyperbole.
Right.
Because we need everything to be life or death so we can justify every action.
Right. 100%. Right.
Okay, so we see that from Plato to Aristotle to Augustine or Augustine, as you say. Even to C.S. Lewis, we ought to teach our children to love what is right and what is good. This is a long tradition of philosophical idea, theological idea, apologetic idea.
Right.
Like this is very much an idea that exists.
Right.
In this realm, and it's not an absurd idea either.
No, not at all.
Right. So as we continue to go, we see a little bit more about how this ordering works and how we would apply it. So C.S. Lewis again said, St. Augustine defines virtue as Ordo Amoris, the ordinate condition of the affections in which every object is accorded that kind of degree of love which is appropriate to it.
Right.
Aristotle says that the aim of education is to make the pupil like and dislike what he ought. When the age for reflective thought comes, the pupil who has been thus trained in ordinate affections or just sentiments will easily find the first principles in ethics. But to the corrupt man, they will never be visible at all, and he can make no progress in that science. Plato before him had said the same. The little human animal will not at first have the right responses. It must be trained to feel pleasure, liking, disgust, and hatred at those things which really are pleasant, likable, disgusting, and hateful.
Right.
Does this make sense?
100%.
Right. So this is a concept of order, having affection appropriate for something in its place.
Right.
Right. And being able to see the different areas of the spectrum
Right.
that all these things
And and this goes back to right and wrong, right? And we've had this conversation on many podcasts before. There needs to be, and this is C.S. Lewis's point. Anybody can say, yeah, but there is a right and there is a wrong.
right.
And we've argued, and C.S. Lewis argues, and many people have argued, if you don't have one unified who gets to say what's right and wrong, you have a million ethics. You have a million first principles. And that's the point that Lewis is making is, hey, that's cool. As you learn and grow up, eventually you get some kind of reasonable capacity to know right and wrong, but that's also defined by who?
Right. Well, it leads to might makes right.
Right. Exactly.
I know a lot of people who consider themselves humanists would want to disagree with that. Like they would,
for sure.
They would say, no, might doesn't make right. But then at the same point, well, you have to be in charge to determine that.
Right.
Right. So
survival of the fittest here.
Right.
You know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. All right. So, look, this is some philosophy. This is some theology.
Sure.
Let's read some scriptures.
Right.
Okay. Mark 12:28-31 says, one of the scribes came up and heard them arguing, and recognizing that he had answered them well, asked him, what commandment is the foremost of all? Jesus answered, the foremost is, hear, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your God as yourself. You shall love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah, there you go.
There is no other commandment greater than these.
Right.
So love God, love others.
Right.
Right.
So far, so good.
So far, so good. So what he's doing here, and we've talked about this before, this is kind of a breakdown of the 10 Commandments. Right. So the first 3 commandments, have no other gods.
Right.
Do not make idols. Do not take the Lord's name in vain.
Right. All dealing with loving, how we love God.
Right. These are all practical steps to loving God. Right.
Which, by the way, there's an order too. Let's just throw that out there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's 10 of them, and God chose one to start with.
He did. Yeah. And because he is at the center of all these things.
Right.
What we're going to find here is that at the order of all affection, God needs to be at the center.
100%.
Right. So when we look at what he said in Exodus 20, verses 1 and 2, then God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Right. So the foundations of all these commandments are built on the idea that God is God.
Right.
And that no one else can deliver us from evil.
Right.
Right. The commandments begin with loving him first.
100%.
Putting him in his correct place.
Right.
And it's weird saying it that way. Like we say this, we have this worship song that we talk about, we crown you King of Glory.
Yeah.
Like, do we crown him? Because I feel like he's got his crown already. Right. And I try not to think too deeply about it.
We recognize your crown of glory.
Yeah, right. Yeah. That's really what we're saying.
Really,
it just sounds more poetic to say it this way. Right. So we recognize his kingship.
Right. And that's the precursor to any order, is recognizing who the orderer is.
Right. Who created these laws?
Right.
Who set the foundations of the earth?
Right.
It was God.
Right.
So we put him first.
Right.
1 John 4:7-8 says, Beloved, let's love one another, for love is from God. And everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. The one who does not love does not know God, because God is love.
Right.
Okay. So if we take this stuff, we break down this concept of Ordo Amoris, right? And we kind of put this together. This is our foundation for kind of what Ordo Amoris is.
Yes.
All of our love, affection, or charity must be prioritized into what is right and what is good. Right. This starts with loving God, who is the author of what is right and good. Our highest love is reserved for him.
Right.
That then leads to love and charity for others, which can only be understood in the light of loving God.
Right.
All things in our life become prioritized in this manner, and to have them out of order is to turn good things into evil things.
Right.
Does this make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Feels pretty scriptural.
Right.
Right? I mean, I don't feel like I'm making this up.
Right.
We are going to read a few more scriptures here.
Sure. Just to simplify, there is a right and a wrong.
Right.
God gets to determine who's right and wrong.
Right.
Well, God is the determiner of right and wrong.
Yeah.
That's point number 2. Point number 3 is everything we do beyond that is because of our love for him. And then point number 4, when we do not love God and we love the other things before God, or in a way that God says not to love them, we've now broken this order.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and it goes beyond just God and then everything else. Everything else gets an order as well.
Right.
And only makes sense that it would.
Well, God doesn't just give us order. He tells us exactly how.
Yeah.
It's not like God just says, okay, here's a list. He tells us in that list, this is how I want you. This is the good way to love blank.
Right. So if Augustine was talking about it,
Yep.
and the term is coined by him,
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis is quoting him about it.
Right.
Right. Like this is church history.
100%.
Right. Would it be fair to say that there is a established concept that has been discussed and accepted among Christians for how many generations? I mean, when is Augustine from? I forget,
Yeah, let's see here. Constantine's 3-something. So he's like, I think 4 maybe.
Yeah, he's
Closer.
right after that.
Yeah.
So for over 1,000 years, 1,500 years, this has not been a very controversial idea.
Well, not only that, but you just also showed that in Exodus, God had an order. So, we can go even further back.
That's where Augustine brings it from.
Where he brings it from.
This
100%.
is where he gets the idea from.
Right.
So the point is, it is established as an idea. It is something that was taught in church. It is something that we see scripturally.
To make this really, really, I don't know, I don't want to say concrete, but in a way that might ruffle some feathers. Like, look at the Catholic Church. Everything they did was really rooted in a lot of what Augustine says.
True.
And by that I mean creating universities, creating hospitals, creating church. I mean, the reason why they did a lot of this is because of the order in which, and I mean, if you know anything about anything Catholic or anything in Catholicism, especially if you go to like a monastery, their whole life is nothing but order.
Yeah.
So this idea that God orders things, I mean, literally he creates nothing from chaos. I mean, he is the great order. So this idea of that God would be an orderer who also orders love. He doesn't lessen love, but he orders it. He prioritizes things. That doesn't mean everything is prioritized by God. Nothing's left off. You see, that's the difference.
Yeah. Well, if everything is where everything has its place in its position. Right. And when it's in the right place, in its right position. Right. It maximizes its potential.
100%.
Right.
So this is a very basic doctrine.
Very basic doctrine. Right. So why are we talking about it then? Right. I think the short answer for this is politics, right? And you know us, we love to be political. We just love talking politics.
Politics and drums are the only things we care about.
Only things we care about. Now, so recently, I don't know if it's recent by the time this comes out, but not too long ago. Yeah. The new vice president, J.D. Vance, had an interview, and he brought up this concept. Now, he didn't necessarily call it Ordo Amoris.
It was assigned to him.
Well, he didn't say it during the interview, but he used it in his rebuttal. Right. Because he said this, and then he got attacked by people saying, "Oh, he is so wrong. That's not right." Right. And then he said, "Go Google Ordo Amoris." Yeah. So here was his quote, and look, I'm just going to say right here, we're not going to try to resolve some of these political concepts. What we want to look at is this a biblical idea? Right. 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 So in this interview, he was discussing immigration. Right. Right. So that's the context. J.D. Vance said, as an American leader, but also just as an American citizen, your compassion belongs first to your fellow citizens. That doesn't mean you hate people from outside of your own borders, but there's this old school concept, and I think it's a very Christian concept, by the way, that you love your family, and then you love your neighbor, and then you love your community, and then you love your fellow citizens in your own country. And then after that, you can focus and prioritize the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. So when he was confronted, he said, I'm talking about Ordo Amoris. Right. Right. So this was what he was discussing, and he was trying to apply it. And so the immediate response from those who were detractors of his and his constituents and
said, "No way, this is
not biblical. That's not what Jesus taught."
Yeah.
And so we said, "Well, isn't it though?
Right.
So that's why we're breaking this
That's why
down.
because people were like, well, that's not even a biblical concept. And
Yeah.
we don't care about the politics. We care about, is it a biblical concept?
Is it a biblical concept?
Yeah.
Right. So here's Augustine again. He said, all men are to be loved equally. But since you cannot do good to all, you are to pay special regard to those who, by the accidents of time or place or circumstance, are brought into closer connection with you. You must take the matter as decided for you by a sort of lot, according as each man happens for the time being to be more closely connected with you.
Yeah.
Okay. So look, there's this church father. This is what he was teaching.
Right.
Is it biblical?
Right.
We've kind of already started showing that it is. Right.
We've already given some scriptures. Yeah.
Right. We started with Exodus. I think most people would agree or should agree that we have a higher duty to Christ than to others. Right. So we've already kind of talked about
as a
this.
Christian, your allegiance, whatever you want to call it, first and foremost is to Jesus,
It's to
above
Jesus.
everything.
Right. And that's what we saw in Mark 12.
Right.
Love God, then love others.
Right.
Now we see it in the Ten Commandments, as we also mentioned, nothing being ahead of God. God is always ordered first.
God's always at the top.
Right. So,
Always. Yep.
so that's foundational. That is an order of love.
Right.
So already we're starting to prove this.
Sure.
But does it continue?
Right.
So, okay, so this is Matthew 26, 6 through 13. Now, when Jesus was in Bethany at the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster vial of very expensive perfume, and she poured it on his head as he was reclining at the table. But the disciples were indignant when they saw this and said, "Why this waste? For this perfume could have been sold for a high price and the money given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you bothering the woman? For she has done a good deed for me. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me. For when she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Truly I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told in memory of her."
And it is.
Right. And that's exactly right.
Right.
So right here, it's kind of interesting because I've tried to think of like a modern, I mean, this is a pretty special act that's happening here.
Right.
It's prophetic. It's fulfilling prophecy. It's
Right.
all these things, right?
Sure.
It's an amazing thing. But at its heart, it's an act of worship,
Right.
right? So here's this woman worshiping Jesus with all of her expensive
Right.
things. She is sacrificing her wealth to worship him.
Right.
And the complaint is, but that wealth could have been used
Right.
to go to the poor,
Right.
right? Now,
By the way, that was also mentioned by a guy who has been known to be skimming from said funds. So let's just put that out there, by the way, because I think that there's another part of this argument that a lot of the times it's like, well, you should give money. You should give money. What about the person handling said money?
yeah, exactly.
Let's look at that heart too. But yeah, there's this idea here that God is saying, or Jesus is saying, because the disciples are, you could help them.
Yeah,
But he's saying, but instead she chose to honor me.
right,
Honoring me can be done via helping others,
right,
but that's not the only way to honor God.
right.
And that's what God is pointing out here. It's what Jesus is saying.
Exactly. And so this is what I think of too when I think of like people who have these large sanctuaries,
Sure,
with
sure.
a paid worship pastor,
Sure.
and like all those types of things. And like I know people will get fussy about it, and they'll
Right.
be like, they should be using that money to take care of the poor. And it's like they're using it to glorify God.
Right.
Apparently. Now look, does everybody do that well with that kind of stuff? No.
Sure,
But was that the intent?
sure,
I think it was.
sure.
So I think my point though is to prioritize Jesus.
Right.
And don't criticize people
Right.
who are trying to prioritize Jesus.
Right.
Right. Because they're not prioritizing a social justice thing that you want prioritized.
Well, and I think too, like if you look at that example of like, okay, so let's talk about the mega church with the paid staff and the paid X, Y, and Z and this and that. Some of that, the argument is better made that like their heart's not right. Then the argument is they shouldn't have spent the money on that. Because at the end of the day, our single foremost only true thing we're called to do is go therefore and make disciples, baptizing. So the mega church, and we first and foremost have a duty to God to preach the gospel.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And that's what I love how he says. He says, whenever this gospel is preached. I love how Jesus says this, because Jesus is also reminding the disciples, it's about me. It's all about me.
It's always
and he's not being selfish. He's saying, yes, you can love people and you can help people, but at the end of the day, it's all about me. And that's our job as Christians. Yes, it is to love others, but first and foremost, it's to love God.
Yeah, well, I think Judas didn't get that. He didn't love Jesus. So when he said we could go help the poor, he was really only talking in a physical concept. He was in a natural concept. He wasn't talking in a spiritual. He wasn't talking about spiritual healing.
It's really interesting too, because he wasn't. And this is, some of this is extra biblical, but like it's really interesting how there's that show The Chosen, and it's really interesting how they depict Judas, because he's actually a very likable, lovable guy.
Sure.
But what's really interesting about Judas's heart throughout it all is he thinks he can help Jesus, not Jesus can help him.
Right.
And now whether that's biblical or not, like as far as there's a truth in that, I think that really shows Judas's heart is that I have something Jesus. So the way they bring Judas in is he is a money manager. So he comes in and volunteers his money management skills for the cause.
Yeah.
And so, but I think that's part of the problem in a lot. We have a lot of things that we think we can help Jesus rather than Jesus can help us.
Right. And that's out of order.
And that's out of order. Exactly.
Right. Exactly. So that's the point of this. God first, others second. So the next question I would have then is, like, if we look at what J.D. Vance said,
right?
He said, it starts with your family, then your neighbor.
Right.
Do we have a higher duty to our families and to others?
Sure.
Biblically.
Right.
Right. So
right, because everybody, I think, so far would probably agree, yeah, we should be loving God. Now, how we love God is where things start to break down. But everybody would say, yeah, God's first.
God's first.
What about your family and what about your friends, neighbors, all that? Yeah.
Exactly. Now, I think this is interesting. We go back to the Ten Commandments. Exodus 20:12 says, honor your father and your mother so that your days may be prolonged on the land which the Lord your God gives you.
Right.
So the Ten Commandments are teaching us how to love God and how to love others. But parents are the only others that are mentioned directly.
Right. And they come with a blessing, by the way.
Right. Yeah.
If you do this, you will be blessed.
It's the only commandment that comes with its own promise.
Right.
So it is fair to say, I think, just based off that, that we have that we definitively have an order of God to prioritize family.
We have an obligation to our families, to our parents especially.
To our parents especially, right? Who are our introduction to family.
Right. Exactly.
All right. So then 1 Timothy 5:3-4 says, honor widows who are actually widows.
I love that one.
But if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to show proper respect for their own family and to give back compensation to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God.
Right.
Okay. So we should care for the widows in our families before leaving them to the care of the church. Right. It's interesting. We talked about how to be religious not too long ago.
Right.
And James talks about, visiting the widows and the orphans. And
right.
But right here, Paul is telling Timothy, and he's using this premise of honoring your parents, that if your mother's a widow, take care of her.
Right.
Don't leave her to the church.
Well, it's really interesting too, because he's not the only one. There's countless references, and some of them we're going to read, but there's countless references in the Bible where God says you need to take care of your family.
Yeah.
It's not the church's job.
Yeah.
You need to.
You need to take care
of
it.
And if you don't, and from the other perspective, if you go to your family and they don't, then so he's creating this order of care. But he's creating it both ways, saying if you are in need, don't go to the church.
Yeah.
Go to your family, because that's where your first line lies.
Exactly, yeah.
But vice versa, he's saying if you have a family, you should be there first and foremost for them.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right, so let's look at Ephesians 5:22-33. This says, wives, subject yourselves to your own husbands as to the Lord.
And that's where it ends. No, I'm just
kidding. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ also is the head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body. But as the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be to their husbands in everything. Husbands, Love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her, so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. So husbands also ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church, because we are parts of his body. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is great, but I am speaking with reference to Christ and the church. Nevertheless, as for you individually, each husband is to love his own wife the same as himself, and the wife must see to it that she respects her husband. Okay. So we've had these conversations before, and we're not going to get into egalitarian, complementarian stuff. But I think what we can pull from this, Paul is saying there's a special connection in relationship,
100%,
right? And Jesus talks about this too and they're quoting Genesis basically when Jesus preaches against divorce,
right?
That there's this special connection,
Right,
that makes a husband and wife as one.
Yes.
Right? And that we are to love, respect, and cherish. The wife is not to subject herself to all men.
No.
But is to subject herself to her husband. And the husband is not to love all women
Just
the way he loves his wife.
Right.
Right?
Well, it's really interesting too. I love what you said earlier about how parents are your introduction to family.
Yeah.
This is almost like the advanced course on family.
This is next.
This is the next step of family. So it goes parents, but then eventually you leave your parents.
Yep.
And when you leave your parents, family becomes redefined. You don't stop loving your parents.
Yep.
But now there's a new element of family.
Right.
Which is you are also called to love in the same way Jesus loves the church.
Right.
Which is that's a serious charge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, the next part of that is having kids.
Right.
And that's that kind of the next thing. I don't necessarily have a verse about having kids, but I do think of that verse where Jesus says, "Who among you would give your son a serpent if he asks for bread?"
Yeah,
right?
a stone or something like yeah.
Right, like the intent, his intent, and his the assumption he makes and the insinuation he makes is that you do good things for your children.
Right.
Like so,
and if you do good things for your children, and God does that for you too, by the way.
Right.
He makes that point. Like you should also be doing good things for others.
Right.
But there's still an order here, right?
There's still an order here, right?
Right.
And that's the problem is, well, should I do good things for others at the expense of my children?
Right.
I know a lot of pastors' kids have felt that way.
Oh, 100%.
Right.
100%.
So Ephesians 6:1-4 says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may turn out well for you and that you may live long on the earth," which is the promise, right? "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." So I guess that was a scripture about kids.
Well, I love the fact, too, by the way, that everything we've read, while it's talking about children, husbands, wives, it all circles back to Jesus. It all circles back to God. He's still the center.
He's still the center.
Right.
All of it is okay, so God's our Father.
Right.
We make him first.
Yep.
Okay. As part of showing that we love others by loving our parents,
right.
honoring them and giving them honor. We join with our spouse as the church joins with Christ.
Right.
Right. And then we have children who we raise up the way God would raise us.
Raise us. Right.
So throughout Scripture, familial relationship is shown as being important and different from other relationships. It has a different place in your life, your family does, than other people.
Right.
Right.
And I think it's really important, too, to say this, because you kind of mentioned it in passing, but it's a really good point. Like, here's what happens when you get it out of order. You said a lot of pastors' kids struggle with that. Why? Because they love the church more than they love their family.
Right.
And when it's out of order, and this is the crazy part, when it's out of order, those kids become bitter at the church because they replaced the family. Okay. So now when they become bitter at the church, who do they then become bitter at?
Jesus.
To go all the way back up to the top.
Up to God.
So when you're out of order, the order literally, when you put it backwards, when you put the church above your family, you then put God at the bottom.
Right.
it all flips.
Exactly.
And then that's not a good thing.
Right. You're
Where when you
absolutely right.
flip it the right way and God is at the top, your family is second, and your children see the church, I'm saying this as a pastor, they then see that they are, not only is the church important, but they're important.
Yeah.
And there is no animosity towards God's people. Therefore, there is no animosity towards God. You see, when you honor it, it all falls into place.
Yeah.
See what I'm saying? But when you flip it, things start to get real wonky real quick.
Yeah, exactly. I wrote in here too, if you think about it, like when we look at that marriage
Right.
conversation, we take vows
Sure.
in marriage, right? This is a part of the marriage ceremony, is
Right.
to swear a vow before God and others. You
Right.
swear an oath,
Right.
right?
Right.
Saying that I'm going to love, honor, and cherish this person regardless of if times are good or bad.
Right. Right.
Who else have you sworn that oath to?
Right. Exactly right. Yeah. Yeah.
You're not supposed to be swearing it to multiple people.
Right.
You and I have discussed this before. God does not like it when we swear a bunch of oaths all over the place.
All over the place.
Right?
Right? Yeah.
You know, and that is why marriage is. It's just another illustration of how marriage is different.
Right.
Right. If I swear an oath to my wife,
Right.
and she's got a flat tire,
Right.
and she's on the side of the highway, and my neighbor has a flat tire, and he's right there in front of his house, and she's calling me to come. Well, I can't come get you because I got to take care of my neighbor first.
Right.
Okay, I didn't swear an oath to my neighbor.
Right. Exactly.
I swore an oath to my wife, and if my neighbor's a good neighbor, he'll understand that my wife comes first.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
We'll come back for you, bud.
Right. We'll
Right?
get you. We'll take care of you.
Right.
But see, this is where that skeptic comes and says, "Well, you should help him because he's right there. It's your time and location, and it's all." But what they don't understand is the bitterness and the resentment that's caused when something is out of order.
Yeah.
So yeah, you help him first, and she sits there for an hour while you help him with your tie. Now you're dealing with marital issues.
Yeah.
And now you see what I'm saying? Like there more issues arise because we've placed our priorities in the wrong places.
Right. And where's his family? Like someone can help. Like if
Sure.
he needs help immediately.
Sure.
Right. Look, there's a lot of ifs, ands, and buts in there. There's a lot of different
100%.
things that we could like.
But at the end of the day, you didn't swear an oath to your neighbor.
Right. We could go over every hypothetical. Right.
Right. Sure.
But the thing is, if all things were equal,
Right.
my wife has to be first.
Right.
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 So then that takes us to the next step, right? So we've got God is 1st, family is 2nd, and then we've got, would you say other believers?
I think that's where it becomes. Yeah, this is where God goes next for sure.
It's your community, right?
Yeah.
It's your community of believers, those who are actively seeking God together.
It's the biblical definition of neighbor, which is proximity. So it's first who's closest to you,
Yeah.
and then who's closest to them, and so your closest community after your family.
Yeah.
Probably, and I'm not talking about proximity I'm talking about emotional investing proximity. It's usually your church community.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. So this first verse I want to share on this, I know there are some people that I've talked about this with some people, and they're not really convinced on this one. And I'm not sure that I have this 100% down on this particular verse, but this is Jesus talking to the disciples, and I'd love to get your take on this. But
Sure.
John 13:34 through 35, Jesus says, "I am giving you a new commandment, that you love one another, just as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So when I read this, the thing that Jesus is calling out that makes them stand apart, that makes them show that they are his, is that they love each other. It doesn't say, he doesn't say the way you love the poor will make you stand out. The way you love your enemy will make it apparent. Right. Now, he does tell us to love our neighbor and to love the stranger and to love our enemy. He does tell us to do all those things. But here he's telling his disciples that it's the love for each other that will basically provide the knowledge that they are his disciples. Now, that could be for that moment of time, right? But still, there's an order in this.
But that's where this is the argument that I would make for this right here, is when you're living in order, there is power in the order. What made the early church so powerful was that people saw how they loved each other, and said, "I want to be a part of that."
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting, and I think that's what diminishes it.
Right.
And I know I don't want it to sound like an exclusive club.
Sure.
But it's like, what makes us different? Is it just that we love indiscriminately?
Right.
Or if we love indiscriminately, does that not just make us a free ATM?
Sure, 100%.
Right? Are we just constantly, oh, thanks, this is great.
Right.
But if we create a community.
If they see how we love our community
Yeah.
and how we value each other,
Right.
and it's different, that's what God called us to be.
Right.
That's when, and just the word itself, because while you were talking, I was like, I'm going to see what that actual Greek word. That Greek word means reciprocally, mutually, or one another. It literally is translated to one another, themselves, or yourselves, as you love yourselves.
Yeah.
And he's not talking about yourself, but he's talking about the Christian circle. So this isn't, Jesus is specifically talking about you as a community of believers need to love one another. Because here's why. If you don't love yourselves, if you put this out of order, people aren't going to see my love.
Right.
And if they don't see my love, they're not seeing me.
Right.
So don't go diminishing me by diminishing yourselves.
Yeah.
But then he go, and we're going to get there. And this is where I think so many people get mad. They get mad because there's an order, because they think somewhere in this order someone's left off. And no one is left off. Now, what you can argue what Vance is saying, you can argue, but no one is left off this list.
Right.
But God says you do this, then you do this, then you do this, and then you do. And this is God saying, and I agree. I think this is so important because I see time and time again where it talks about being unified in the church.
Yes.
And the importance of unity, the importance of they're selling all of their things and they held everything together as one. It didn't say that they were just giving it all away to the poor. It was giving, as everybody had needs in their community. There's something different about the love of our church.
Well, let's read that one.
Yeah.
So Acts chapter 2, verses 43 through 47. Mm-hmm. Everyone kept feeling a sense of awe, and many wonders and signs were taking place through the apostles. And all the believers were together and had all things in common. And they would sell their property and possessions and share them with all, to the extent that anyone
Had a need.
had a need. Day by day, continuing with one mind in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, they were taking their meals together with gladness and sincerity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord was adding to their number day by day those who were saved. Right? So they're doing this amongst themselves.
Right.
Right? And then others are being added day by day as they witness what's happening and how they're living, what they're doing.
Right.
And one version of this says they eliminated need in this way, which, by the way, this is how we know that the early church and Jesus were not socialists.
Right.
Because they were effective at eliminating need.
Right. And it says, and they were sharing with them all it literally in the Greek, as anyone has need. It says that at the end. So this idea is they weren't just selling and giving everything away.
Right.
They were meeting people's needs.
Yes.
That's the difference.
Exactly.
And they also weren't selling. It didn't say they sold everything. It says they were selling their possessions.
Yeah.
So let me just be clear. Like, this is something really funny that people always are like, oh my gosh, we should sell everything. Lydia did not sell her house.
Right.
That's where the church met.
Yeah. They sold off some of their
She didn't sell her business. They sold, but look at Ananias and Sapphira. We have an extra field. We're gonna give you the field. And then what happens? They don't. And then they die. But see, this is what I'm saying. Like, as need arrived, people were like, hey, does anybody have anything extra? We do this today in our churches.
Yes, we do.
When a need arrives, literally our policy in our churches, when someone has a need, we send out a church-wide email and an announcement and say, hey, we don't blast that person and say, hey, Joe Schmo lost his job. He needs groceries. No, but we say, hey, there's an individual in the community. Yeah. Can anybody spare anything?
Exactly.
And the church shows up.
Exactly.
That didn't mean they sold their car to do it.
Right.
But they might have not had Starbucks that week.
Right.
Well,
and that is one of those things that, like, again, you take this order of love. Let's say you have that situation, right? Okay, so Joe in the church, Joe Schmo in the church is in need of a surgery. He can't afford it, right?
Right.
I'm going to sell my car to help pay for his surgery, but now I can't get to work.
Right.
So now my kids are going to lose their house. Right. Do you see how this becomes a spiral?
100%.
There has to be some level of order,
right,
in how we give, who we give to, and when we do it.
Well, and not only that, like you and I were talking earlier, and I think this is important too. Like, we always talk, especially with our elders, one of the requirements for an elder is that they will manage their house well. And so God is even saying right here, there's an order. If you want to be in charge in the church, you better have your house in order.
Yeah.
So he says, say God says, I want you to be a leader. Okay, well, that better mean first you better prioritize your house. And this is something we talk about as elders. If your house is out of order, we're not here to judge you, but we're here to say you better go take care of that. That's more important than being in charge here at church.
Yeah.
Not because and that means more work for me, that means more work but because the order of love is you love your family first.
Yeah.
Well, not first, but above the church.
Above the church. Yeah, exactly. Let's look at Hebrews 10:19 through 25. Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way, which he inaugurated for us through the veil, that is, through his flesh, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let's approach God with a sincere heart and full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let's hold firmly to the confessions of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful, and let's consider how to encourage one another in love and good deeds, not abandoning our own meeting together, as is the habit of some people, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. So what he sets up here in Hebrews is that as he starts with what God did, and how Jesus has done all of this for us, therefore, that we should then be encouraged to love one another with our good deeds, not abandoning our meetings together. This is about the church body.
This is about the church body, 100%.
This is not about your community picnic.
No.
Where,
this is what I call the first degree of a neighbor.
Yeah.
Right. This is your intimate community. This is the people who know you like your family kind of knows you. You see, there's an intimacy here. God knows you more than anybody.
Yep.
Your family knows you better than most people.
Yep.
Your church knows you.
Yep.
Your neighbor might not know you. You see what I'm saying? But your church does. Well, they should at least. And a good church, they should know, they should be invested in you.
Yeah.
So, but again, look at that hierarchy. God knows you the most. Your family knows you better than most.
Yeah.
And then your church knows you.
Right. And so you might be saying, well, okay, look, I get it, but we shouldn't be dismissive of unbelievers.
Sure.
And I agree with you. However,
right.
Let's hear what Paul had to say.
Sure.
Okay, so in 2 Corinthians 14,
Yeah.
It's 5:14 through 18. I forget what the chapter is. We'll have to look that up and put that in the thing. But Paul says this. He says, "Do not be mismatched with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and lawlessness share together? Or what does light have in common with darkness? Or what harmony does Christ have with Belial? Or what does a believer share with an unbeliever? Or what agreement does the temple of God have with idols? For we are the temple of the living God, just as God said, I dwell among them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore come out of their midst and be separate, says the Lord, and do not touch what is unclean, and I will welcome you, and I will be a father to you, and you shall be my sons and daughters to me, says the Lord Almighty."
2 Corinthians 6.
2 Corinthians 6. 14 through 18 there. Okay, so right here, Paul is teaching the church that it is appropriate to separate ourselves from the unbeliever, right? He is in a sense telling us that there is a level of separation that needs to occur.
Sure.
Right? Now, 1 Corinthians 5:12 through 13 says, "For what business of mine is it to judge outsiders? Do you not judge those who are within the church? But those who are outside, God judges. Remove the evil person from among yourselves." Right? So right here, Paul is showing us that there is a commandment even to disassociate with unbelievers and heretics.
Well, not only that, he's also giving us permission to judge each other.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good point.
There's a prioritization here that says with this tier comes judgment.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that in a negative way. What he's saying is there's an accountability that you and I have to each other because we go to church together, because you're part of the community.
Yeah.
That I don't have with my neighbor.
Right.
And here's an example of that. Like if my neighbor's outside getting hammered, I should still love them. I should still care for them. But I don't have the same duty as I do to you to go to you and be like, bro, what's going on?
Yeah.
Now I should probably care for them, but I may not have a relationship with my neighbor to have that equity to say those things. You see again, when things are in order, you have more ability to do things.
Yeah.
And that's where I find a lot of people really struggle because they want to jump down to this tier and talk to them about why we should care about X, Y, and Z, but they have no authority to speak into the lives of X, Y, and Z.
Right.
They can't change X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
So all they're doing is either throwing money, time, or Facebook posts at X, Y, and Z. You
Right.
know?
Well, yeah, exactly.
Nothing's changing in that model. In this model, things actually change.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a difference.
Exactly.
And Paul is saying, hey, if they don't change, by the way, then they don't need to be part of this community.
Right. And that insinuates they don't get the benefit of that community.
For sure.
Right. And again, this is not a
What is
condemnation.
No.
But this is you've chosen something else.
And there's a benefit to this, just like there's a benefit to marriage that I don't have with other communities.
Exactly.
You know? Well, and think about it this way. What does he say when we talk about conflict? We first go to our brother. Then if they don't listen, we bring another brother with us. And if not, then it says we go to the church. And then we treat them as an unbeliever.
Right.
That doesn't mean we don't love them. It means they do lose privileges.
Yeah. It means the treatment is different.
Right.
It doesn't mean it's necessarily bad.
Right.
Right.
And again, let's just order this real quick. How I love my church is not the same way I love my family. I do not love the ladies in this church the way I love my wife. Okay?
Yes.
That's just not the same. I don't love my wife the same I love God. I love her.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, if my wife says something and God says something and they are not in alignment, I'm not going with my wife. I'm going with God.
Right. Exactly.
And it's nothing against my wife. I love her. Same thing down here. If my wife says something and a lady says something at church, guess who I'm going with?
Going with your wife.
My wife.
Yeah.
Unless the lady says something that God says something, and then it's of Godish. You know,
Right.
but this
I get
is
what you're
how the order works.
Exactly.
And it works.
It does.
If you put those the other way around, things get out of order and then chaos begins to ensue.
Right. Absolutely. Okay, here's Jesus in Matthew 15:21 through 28. Jesus went away from there and withdrew into the region of Tyre and Sidon. And a Canaanite woman from that region came out and began to cry out, saying, "Have mercy on me, Lord, son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed." But he did not answer her with even a word. And his disciples came up and urged him, saying, "Send her away, because she keeps shouting at us." And he answered and said, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and began to bow down before him, saying, "Lord, help me." Yet he answered and said, "It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." And she said, "Yes, Lord, but please help, for even the dogs feed on the crumbs that fall from your master's table." Then Jesus said to her, "O woman, your faith is great. It shall be done for you as you desire." And her daughter was healed at once. Right? So even here, Jesus articulates that his ministry was to the Jew first and then to everybody else.
Right.
Right. Now, what we see here, though, is a great example of what made you his people was your faith in him.
Right.
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 But he had an order how he was going to do this.
Sure.
Right.
The Gentiles were loved, but not in the same preaching way that Jesus. You see what I'm saying? Like the attention Jesus gave was to the Jews.
Yes.
Now, yeah, there's Gentiles who slipped in there. It's not until really Peter and Paul come along that the ministry to the Gentiles really, because the Gentiles see what the Jews are doing and say, "Who is this Jesus?
Yeah.
Why? Well, we want to be a part of him." And then the Jews are like, "No, forget them.
Yeah.
Make them Christians." You know.
Right. And it says she was a Canaanite woman,
Right.
so she was probably from that land. She just wasn't of Jewish heritage.
Jewish heritage, right?
So she understood what was going on.
Right.
She understood. She had a
And that's why he recognizes her.
Yeah. But then he also, I think what makes a big difference here too is she does not appeal to him and say, "Excuse me, Jesus."
Right.
That's bigotry.
Right. Right.
Jesus, you're a bigot, right? She doesn't say that. She doesn't say, "You should love, if you're truly the Son of God, you would love me as much as you love him."
Right, right.
Right? As much as you love your disciples, you would treat
Right.
me the same, you would give me the same.
Right.
No, instead she says, "Yes, you're right. I'm not the child,
Right.
but even the dogs sometimes get some of the scraps."
Right, right, right.
Sometimes that blessing that you're giving, and she recognizes the order
Right.
of it all.
Right. Right. Right.
And why is she making this plea? She's making this plea for her daughter.
Right.
Not for her, right?
Right.
She's loving her daughter as she does herself.
Right.
She has prioritized her love for her daughter and has correctly received the order that Christ has provided for her, and he says, your faith has made
It's great. It's great.
Has healed her.
Yeah, it's healed her. Yeah.
So, like, even here, we see Jesus articulates this hierarchy.
Right.
Right. And it's not until Acts we see, like, Peter released to go start preaching to the Gentiles.
Right.
And then Paul, of course, is called to the Gentiles as well.
Right, because it's really interesting. Jesus doesn't really talk a ton about dietary laws.
Right.
The laws we talk about as far as, like, he talks a ton about moral law.
Yeah.
But Mosaic law, he says, in fact, I've come to uphold that.
Right.
So there's this idea that his target audience is still Jews. And we know this. I mean, this is biblical. This is not bigotry. It's just biblical.
It is.
But what's really interesting is, again, if we talk about the order, God didn't forget about the Gentiles. You see what I'm saying? Like, I think people have problems with the order because they feel like someone's getting left out. No, not at all.
No.
In fact, when it's in order, everybody gets taken care of.
Exactly. So then that brings us to everybody else.
Right.
Or our neighbor.
Outside.
Right?
Right.
And so I think the problem with this is our neighbor is way too broad a concept.
Correct.
Right? So that's why we've kind of broken this down. You've got your immediate church family. You've got your family. You've got Jesus at the head. Right? And then you've got those who are in your immediate community outside of that.
Right.
Right. Now, we might touch on this a little bit more in a minute. I think it's interesting to note what we really haven't said is people from other countries yet.
Right.
Right. Like this has really been about those who you're in contact with, as Augustine had.
100%. And that's what his was, because the idea of foreign aid was so incredibly
foreign.
Foreign, 100%. Yeah. In Jesus' time and Augustine's time, and I mean, this idea of a globalized world doesn't happen until the 21st century, really, or 20th century, I guess you could say, where this idea. So when Jesus really is talking about your neighbor, yeah, we can go all the way to Canada, and then we could go across to Russia or across to Great Britain or down to, we can slowly move from the countries that touch our country to the continents that are close. We can do that, but Jesus, we don't need to do that, because if we really actually follow what Jesus says, that'll naturally happen.
Yeah.
Because Jesus says, okay, now let's talk about the people you're in contact with that aren't. Let's talk about that guy who does live next door to you, who is your neighbor, your genuine, by the definition of a word, neighbor.
Right. Well, I think when we look at Luke 10:30 through 37, I'm not going to read this.
Sure.
But this is the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Right.
So we know, like, with the Samaritans didn't live.
No.
Like, it almost was its own nation.
Right.
It was its own group.
Right.
Right. And there was a lot of animosity.
Yes, there was.
Here between the Samaritans and
they were seen as second class.
Yes.
Basically.
Exactly. And so that's where this Good Samaritan kind of comes in. And so, like, right after Jesus says, love God, love your neighbor, the response was, well, who's my neighbor?
Who's my neighbor, right?
And this is really what I think people are levying against people like J.D. Vance. Well, you're trying to get out of loving people by defining who your neighbor is.
Right.
I think they're missing the boat.
Right.
But, and I think they're misunderstanding maybe this concept here.
Right.
And Jesus Jesus, once the guy says, who's my neighbor? Jesus tells this parable.
Right.
And what's interesting is he says, which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands? He doesn't tell him who he should help.
Right.
He asks him which of these things are the most helpful, or which of these people looked the most helpful. You know what I mean?
In a strange way, he actually is showing the hierarchy.
Yeah.
Because he gives two Jewish people who are a good Jewish guy and a guy. So he gives
a priest and a Levite, right?
Yeah. So he's giving people a tier above, quote unquote.
Yeah.
So Jesus is saying these people should have helped him.
Yes.
Because they by definition were the ones who. But it's really interesting. He uses this great example to say, well, your neighbor. He doesn't say that they aren't neighbors. He says, who is the neighbor?
Right.
He says, well, the neighbor's not the two who were within the circle, but your neighbor's the one who stops.
Yeah. And I think there's something in that.
Right.
Is it still requires the Samaritan to come across him.
Sure.
Right. It still requires the Samaritan to cross paths. This is still very much a who did you come across?
Sure.
Right.
Right.
And there's something to be said there. Now,
this is the proximity that Augustine is talking about.
Right. Exactly.
He talks about the coincidence of time or whatever he calls it.
Yeah. It comes by chance, right? So I think this is the thing. What we know about the Samaritan, though, is it doesn't it was an expense of his on him to take care of this man.
Right.
Doesn't say that it ruined him. Doesn't say
Right.
that he forfeited his family or lost their house or anything like that. But he used out of his abundance. He took care of him and did what was right.
Right.
So I think at this point, there's definitely this is a very strong passage.
Sure.
About taking care of people, helping people that are in need.
Sure.
Being there. Jesus absolutely taught that we should take care of people in need.
100%.
Right? And he talks about
his ministry does that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He says, "Hey, you visited me when I was in prison. You gave me water when I was thirsty. You did all these things, right?"
Right.
And that's why we should then visit people who are in prison.
Right.
That's why we should give people who are thirsty water.
Right.
Right. There is a truth in all of that.
But the big question is, at what expense?
To a degree, yeah.
You see what I mean? Like, that's what it really boils down to is we should do all these things, but do we do that at the expense of loving God?
Right.
Do we do that at the expense of loving our family? Do we do that at the expense of loving God's people?
Right.
No, you don't. That's just you don't.
You can't.
You can't because that's flipping it backwards.
Right. I cannot neglect my wife for the stranger.
100%.
And I cannot neglect my children for my neighbor.
Right.
I cannot neglect God for a nation.
Right.
Right. There's so many different things that play into that. And
Sure.
so there is clear hierarchy.
Right.
Where this becomes difficult is practical application.
100%. Right.
We start talking about hypotheticals and you could apply it this here or apply that there.
Sure.
And then you hear the counter arguments. And now, I say, if my wife's got a flat and my neighbor's got a flat, who should I help?
Right.
And then it's like, well, what if it's not your neighbor has a flat? What if he's having a heart attack?
Right.
Okay, well, now we're changing the script, right?
Right.
So
100%. 100%.
all these different types of hypotheticals, right?
Right.
And so we could run through all that. But this is why, we did an episode a while back about living by the Spirit.
100%.
Make Christ first, follow him, you set these priorities, and then you let him show you how to live those things out.
100%.
Right? So when we talk about the Ordo Amoris, when we talk about an order of love, it's definitely biblical.
Right.
It's definitely all there.
Right.
Now, the reason it came up, though, is the question is, does it apply to U.S. immigration policy?
Sure. Right. That's how it came up. Right.
Right. And, we're obviously very astute politically. My only answer to that is maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I would say this. I would say that if your argument for why we should be more liberal in our immigration policies is that it's because Jesus taught us to be good Samaritans,
right?
Then you have to accept Ordo Amoris as a part of that.
Well, and it's not even in my book. I don't even see it as it's not a it's a policy problem, not a love problem.
Well, that's
you see what I mean, like that. Like
this is the issue with the people who want to have the argument,
right?
And I'm trying to say that as lovingly as I can. Is the assumption is always left or right?
Right.
If you don't. Okay, here's the example, right? How many times have you seen a commercial from a Republican or a Democrat that says the other side hates our veterans?
Right.
Because we put together this veteran bill.
Yeah, and then they torpedoed.
And they torpedoed. They didn't want to vote for it, right? And then you find out that bill also contained all this other earmarks for all these other things that the other party. But they kind of they coattail that stuff in to get their agendas passed. And if it doesn't get passed, then they can take the one thing that's universally appreciated and say, well, see, they voted against this one universal concept, right? It's all very underhanded. It's all very sneaky. It's all very political.
Sure.
Right? And so what happens is when somebody has this argument, what they say is God said love our neighbor. Deportation is not loving.
Right.
Therefore, you don't love your neighbor. Therefore, you're not a Christian.
Right.
Right?
Right.
That's how the argument then suddenly becomes.
Right.
And I think the issue here is not a love. I heard the guy who's now the border czar.
Yeah.
He was talking. I forget who he was talking to and what the context was, but somebody accused him of that, and he was like, "I have worked the border.
Right.
I have seen what they do to these women and these children, these mules and these people who take advantage of them. I have seen the dead bodies of the people who are trying to come here, and if we keep telling them that they can come here, they're going to keep dying."
Right.
In his mind, now you can agree or disagree with him, right? in his mind, the more loving thing to do
Right.
is to close the border
Right.
or change the way the border is
Right.
done, right? Now, look, we can have all sorts of arguments about what's the right policy, how do you make it happen, how do you do this? What really becomes a problem is when we tell each other that you're not loving because you didn't vote for the person I voted for.
Right.
You're not loving because you didn't do this. And I'm going to torpedo
Right.
a biblical concept like Ordo Amoris because I can't stand J.D. Vance and Donald Trump.
Right.
Right?
Right. Love, the way God loves, there is no love at the expanse of.
Right.
That term is not in God's definition.
Yeah.
Like, there is no, and so I think anytime and I feel like that, and I didn't even see the J.D. Vance quote. I only heard the fallout. I don't pay attention that much enough to know. But everything I was reading was really interesting because I was thinking to myself, reading the quote, hearing the context, things like that, the idea that we should love ourselves first is a biblical idea. And let me explain what I mean by that. When Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, let's just put that into context. If you do not love yourself, and by that I mean if you do not take care of your body, if you do not, then you are loving your neighbor poorly.
Right.
And I think that that's really what for me, this all boils down to is if we cannot fully love ourselves, we're not doing it's an injustice
Right.
to someone else.
Well, if you love yourself by only indulging,
right.
then you love somebody else by giving into their indulgences.
And I'm not here to even debate about deportation and immigration. But what I am saying is when we're struggling with drug issues, when we're struggling, there's so many issues that the world is facing, but then our nation is facing. And then we're going to have the audacity to say, hey, let us fix you. That's why Jesus says, Paul really says it. Why Paul says, don't become an elder if your house isn't in order.
Right.
Because you're just going to do an injustice to the church. I think we're doing an injustice to others by trying to police and politicize the world when we ourselves are a hot mess.
Right. But see, here's the thing. Even by going and saying, I believe that it is the more loving thing to do to vote for a politician who's going to support these more liberal immigration.
Sure.
You are walking out Ordo Amoris.
Sure.
You are prioritizing a specific type of love and how it should look based on what you believe the teachings of Jesus to be.
100%.
Right? So we can have we can argue till we're blue in the face. I don't know if we're going to come to an agreement or a conclusion about how to apply this in a political sense or in a international sense.
Sure. But there is a theological sense.
But there is definitely a theological precedence for this idea.
Yeah.
I think if you're going to appeal to love, biblical love, you have to understand it. You have to include it in the conversation.
Right.
Right. And at the end of the day, try to remember that the people you're arguing with don't hate.
Right.
They apply love differently.
100%.
And when you approach someone that way, you approach them with more gentleness, more care, and more compassion. I don't know, more like Jesus.
For sure.
Right?
For sure. For sure.
Than if you don't.
Right.
Right? When you treat somebody as if they are Satan himself because they didn't support something, disagree with you on something, and it can be something incredibly awful.
Right.
Okay, I think abortion is the greatest evil that America has ever faced.
Sure.
Right? It's also the greatest infringement of human rights we've ever seen.
Sure.
Right? I need to be gentle and loving to those who disagree with me on that. Right. Even though in my heart, they're advocating for the murder of children.
It's like what I said on a sermon. I didn't say it. Jesus says. Jesus literally says, "You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy." But I say to you, like that's how Jesus talked. Like Jesus is like, "Hey, your love is just misplaced."
Right. Yeah,
that's all he's saying.
It's out of order.
It's not that. Yeah, it's out of order, right? And I think that's how we have to approach all of these conversations, like you said. But I think just for me, the funny thing about the reason why we're even talking about this was that we as Christians got so up in arms that there would be a hierarchy of love. Mm-hmm. The first commandment is a hierarchy of love.
Yeah, the 10 commandments.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, so from that moment on, and if you really are living in a godly, God-honoring way, no one is left out of your love.
You're right.
And so if there's someone out there who's really struggling with this to say like, why? You're telling me I should prioritize my family over that guy on the street corner? Maybe. First off, what is the Spirit saying? Maybe you're prioritizing your family too much.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Maybe you're using your family as an excuse not to do something.
100%.
And I think that's maybe where the opposition for this comes from.
Sure.
Is they see the abuse of it or the perceived potential abuse of it.
Sure.
And say that would be a problem.
Right.
But you can't throw babies out with the bathwater. You have to. We can't say this isn't a principle. We have to help. We have to go to God and say, how do we rightfully apply this principle?
Whether you agree with it or not, I'll share a practical way we do this. In our church, we do not help people monetarily outside of the church. We don't.
Sure.
That doesn't mean we don't help them. So when someone comes to our church with needs, I have a list of resources for over 127 different organizations in our St. Louis, St. Charles, and Jefferson County, the other one, all the surrounding counties of St. Louis, that we can call, that do these things. This is their job. They receive funding. This is what they do, and we send them there. I've sat on the phone with people with our Spire? What is that? Gas? It's with Spire. That's our local one, and helped them get their bill on a bill payment plan, things like that. That's not we don't just turn them away. Is what I'm saying. But we don't love them in the same way we love the person in the church. And the person in the church, we do give them those resources and say, hey, here are these resources. Yeah. But we also take it one step further and say, hey, we're going to take up a collection for you and see what we can do.
Yeah.
And that's not because we don't love the random stranger less. We love differently.
Yeah.
Because if we tried to love that stranger, then that person here in the church would not be able to. You see, then we start forsaking the love of them, and then now we're forsaking our family to take it. It just when out of order. It's the truth. Chaos ensues, and I have seen it.
Yeah.
Or abuse ensues.
Right.
Exactly.
So this might be something you agree with or disagree with. I think ultimately where we have to come together is agree that it's about the application.
Right.
There definitely is an order to how we prioritize our love.
Right.
It's definitely biblical.
Right.
It's definitely there.
Right.
Now what we have to do is lovingly apply it
right.
and walk it out. And I think what you were talking about, how the church does it here, I think that's a great place to start from a church community standpoint. Sure. And how you would look at that. I think it does bring me to a question, though, for you. So as the pastor of the church, right, let's say the church had enough money to provide drum lessons for one person. Should they give it to your son who wants drum lessons or to my daughter who wants drum lessons?
Oh, man. Well, the order would say I have to prioritize my family here, unfortunately.
Well, what I think we can all enjoy and prioritize is a little bit of drums
for this floor tom.
For this floor tom for everybody at all times.